Hey everyone, it's Spacepan. Prince of Queens asked me to do a guest video since he's taking a short break. Some of you might remember me from last year when I organized the Red Pill screening for the Twin Cities Men's Center here in Minneapolis, and Prince graciously hosted the Q&A panel that followed. But for those of you who are wondering who I am and where I came from, I'm an American MRA who evolved into a perennial YouTube lurker after grabbing my philosophy degree. Let's be real, what the fuck else was I going to do with that degree? So for the last few years, I've dug as far as I could into the various compartments of both feminism and the manosphere. And my starting point was quite typical: feminist, egalitarian, by default. After all, if you believe in equality, you believe in feminism, right? Now, given that we're in 2018, the fourth current year, this probably isn't particularly convincing to you. But 5, 10, or maybe even 15 years ago, before anti-feminism went more or less mainstream, you would be in much rarer, smaller company if you dared to deny this. So what changed? Now, it's tempting to say that the change is the existence of anti-feminism itself, but this is false. Anti-feminists have existed as long as feminists have. What's quite disturbing is that these anti-feminists, they weren't anti-feminists in the sense in which feminists employ the term, which is to smear anyone who opposes them or to characterize all traditionalists as monolithically Victorian caricatures. But they were anti-feminists in the sense that they identified feminist stances and found reason to oppose them. Here I want to mention that there are many videos on this channel that are actually pretty informative, in particular when it comes to defining fourth wave feminism, but especially a specific video which was the 4 different kinds of female feminists. The reason I'm mentioning it here is because that is something that's very, very interesting that I don't want to totally dismiss. However, what I'm trying to point out here is that the similarities are more important than the differences when it comes to feminism. And honestly, I think that Paul Elam gave us one of the absolute best ways of proving this. To this day, I have not found a single useful example of the women's movement advocating for anything that was not to the immediate perceived benefit of women exclusively. And this is one of dozens of one-move checkmates that the women's movement, by and large, has no real answer to. Those of you who were raised religious then became atheists just in time to contribute to the total bloodbath that would become the template for online discourse. You should be able to relate to this. The red pill came in the form of unbeatable one-move checkmate arguments, and both MRAs and atheists are prone to falling into the trap of thoroughly crushing their enemies, snorting their remains, and then wildly red pill raging all over whatever bizarre new frontiers the internet takes us. And that is where the difference lies. The so-called manosphere has always existed to one degree or another. All socially inconvenient movements fundamentally based in the truth are suppressed in a pre-internet world, then spring out of apparently nowhere as internet access becomes more commonplace. Now, what is especially entertaining about the relationship between the women's and the men's movement is that each one essentially compiles all of the worst stereotypes of each gender. The women's movement is generally characterized by emotional, irrational, nagging, and hypergamous entitlement, whereas the men's movement is mostly silent outside of its fiery outbursts. It doesn't ask for directions, and it waited for the tumor to reach the size of a golf ball before anyone said, "Hey, let's go see a doctor, maybe, or walk it off." Yet when it comes to the stereotypes of power, the situation is more ironic than it is appropriate. The best example of a patriarchy you'll ever find is best characterized by the women's movement. It's their combination of the earnest feeling of entitlement and just the sheer power they've amassed. Meanwhile, the men's movement kind of just passively sucks dick and cooks steak in timid hopes that it will sneak in a red pill here or there. Now, in terms of institutional power, there really is no comparison. The women's movement has won. The women's movement is the status quo. Yet this measure of strength has ironically become the women's movement's greatest weakness. The coffee shop anti-feminist may be swift to point out that the women's movement is no longer serving women's interests. Now, personally, as a radical MRA, I literally care 0% about what society needs to do for women. And those of you who think your attitude is more nuanced because you care about everyone or whatever, I don't know, consider the fact that men have never lived in any other world but a world that doesn't give a fuck about them. So the greatest strength of the women's movement, it's in the sheer magnitude of its solutions. The greatest strength of the men's movement is in its sheer magnitude of problems. Feminism is the status quo. So now what we can see is that there's a really good reason for feminists to target MRAs so relentlessly, despite the fact that 99% of all people will go ahead and dismiss MRAs without feminist help for most of the same reasons that feminism was able to dominate the status quo in the first place. And basically, it's because of gynocentrism. It's because the reason that we had 3 waves of a women's movement before having even a single wave of the men's movement was not because women needed it more. It's because we just care about women more. Everything follows from there. It explains the patriarchal human history, it explains traditionalism, it explains feminism, and it explains why the men's rights movement can't get any traction. Now, for the feminists, the proper course of action is now and always has been very obvious. As a gender equality movement, the movement's largest umbrella, they have unwittingly taken the responsibility for men's issues onto themselves. But because they've left themselves open in this way, any jackass who learns the first thing about gender issues can completely savage their movement. And there's only 3 real defenses against this. 1, you anti-feminists aren't doing anything about it. You don't really care about men. You just hate women. So this argument, it doesn't really get feminists off the hook, nor does it realistically apply to people who explicitly identify as MRAs, or even to most MGTOW. However, this criticism is certainly valid toward a large number of anti-feminists, particularly those in the alt-right. Those of you who tuned into the Thoughtgate drama are well aware of this. Now, personally, I find trad thought anti-feminist to be contemptible, particularly when a woman says she's anti-feminist primarily because she thinks housewives are undervalued or whatever. Sorry, that's not feminists' fault. That's the fault of washing machines and vacuum cleaners, and it's called obsolescence, and the pearl-clutching culture it's embroiled in makes me eternally grateful that I ended up preferring dick. Number 2, we're a women's movement. Go start your own movement if you care about men so much. So this is the stance that the infamous Big Red, aka Channy Banks, ultimately took. Now, I say ultimately because this stands in direct contradiction to the Tumblr copy pasta that she's reading, fuckface. Which is actually the last defense. The third defense is that, feminism fights for men too. Now, if you encounter a feminist who claims that feminism or the women's movement cares about men, you know you're dealing with someone who has no care or concern for half of all humans except as a means to their ends. This is the most soulless, dishonest, and chilling defenses for a feminist to take because they've got nothing. But that is how feminists can defeat the men's movement. All they would have to do is make that last point true. The men's movement is extremely vulnerable here because it hasn't had any real victories. The Red Pill documentary raises awareness, but awareness is the consolation prize of advocacy. MRAs are ecstatic to take whatever they can get because it's that, nothing, or a smear. And if you're not convinced that feminists go out of their way to target MRAs, please check out Bane's 666AU's series, The Propaganda of Toxic Feminism. The Isla Vista shootings defined a pattern that has been followed by feminists so religiously that this series is almost on episode 70, representing over 100 hours worth of examples of feminists smearing the men's rights movement by most commonly identifying non-MRAs as MRAs. And in the case of Roosh V, they'll even define a TradCon PUA anti-MRA as an MRA because reasons. Now, in short, they know intuitively that the manosphere has a point and that it's pointed directly at their heart. So they can either reposition their heart such that the MRM is impotent to criticize them, or they can take the easier and more obvious route of bashing the threat itself. Given that MRAs are so easily dismissed as virgin neck-bearded fedoras, it's not surprising that most feminists would rather quash these soggy-kneed bigots than seriously consider their points. Now, this is where the gays come in and fuck their shit up. If you were tuned in during the first, second, or third current years, you probably noticed an ongoing scare of gay misogyny. Again, Prince has covered this topic in the past, and it's well worth giving a listen. But in a nutshell, the narrative is that women are harassed by gay men without end. Basically, we're expected to believe that women having their tits grabbed by their drunk gay bestie is basically rape. Start a hashtag. Oh my god, Aziz Ansari is a bad date. The air conditioning is too cold, and whoops, I just slipped and fell on a dick. Child support, please. I have 2 questions. 1, why are gays predominantly feminist? And 2, why are feminists attacking gays? These answers are actually simple. Gays inherited feminism as part of the progressive mystery bag. Christians gave us bad reasons for some good ideas. And when more progressive or libertarian-minded people began to reject conservatism, traditionalism, and religion, I believe that they correctly identified that much of the reasoning behind the traditional status quo was faulty, but then they took it a step too far. We assumed that because the reasons given were bad, that the conclusions must also be false. And it wasn't until maybe Jordan Peterson showed up that hardly anyone offered secular justifications for otherwise religious conclusions. Now, if you set out and search for it, you might find some of this in Christian apologetics, but the point is that it was largely esoteric until recently, where it's become less esoteric. So gays tend to reject religion in one of two ways. You either go full capital A atheist, thus adopting a position consistent with all of the most powerful arguments atheists make against theists, or they reject religion in a moderate or agnostic sense. And they might identify as either religious or spiritual, but then they'll conveniently cherry pick anything out of their religious text that's incongruent to landing dick first in some of that sweet boy pussy. And in the midst of this process of self-discovery, denying the truth, accepting the truth, realizing you won't have natural babies, and the implicit dehumanization that comes with the fact that the peaceful existence of your sexual preference is contingent on society's permission, it's practically inconceivable that the typical gay man stops to consider how privileged he is to be gay. Now, the gay man enjoys a functional immunity to both unwanted pregnancy and false rape allegations, along with many of the social benefits women enjoy, namely that men are fucking easy because men actually like sex and don't come pre-programmed with the notion that their sexuality is something they can leverage for financial security. This is where I believe the gays could benefit from a bit of pseudo-traditionalism, not such that they become insufferable hypergamous bitches, but so that more men begin to value themselves as sexual agents whose choices matter. The relative advantages enjoyed by gay men do not define the gay experience. They merely become the best way to understand the gay experience relative to the non-gay experience. In other words, the world of the straight male and the gay male are 95% identical. It's just that gayness isn't relevant unless you're talking about that 5% difference. Confirmation bias then compounds this perception repeatedly until the notion of any sort of male overlap between gay and straight males is just completely lost. This means that even though gay men endure men's issues in largely the same capacity that their straight counterparts do, they're less likely to perceive it as a men's issue because the process of identifying yourself as gay naturally emphasizes those ways in which you are different, then places those differences at the center of your own identity. Now, the reason that feminists have made an issue of gay men is the same reason that they make an issue of anything. There are no legitimate women's issues. Every single women's issue is based in a combination of exaggerations and outright falsehoods. This means that the problems championed by the women's movement are not defined by reality or by empirical evidence. It is defined via selective histrionics. Junk social science can bridge any fiery anecdote into a cultural epidemic. So the issues that are most important in the women's movement are basically whatever is deemed most likely to guilt trip people into funding their communist bullshit. But I think they picked a bad battle here. They've underestimated the capacity of gay males to be obnoxious, entitled, raving fucking bitches. Which, in hindsight, kind of seems like a no-brainer, but then again, I'm not sure anyone with even a single brain still buys into the wage gap myth, so perhaps the stupidity of targeting gay men was in character after all. So to conclude, every single men's rights talking point presents an opportunity for feminists to mobilize their ill-gotten gains in the service of equality of the sexes. They're in an awkward position because they need to find a way to address men's issues without admitting that they've been ignoring men's issues the entire time. And the easiest way out at first glance is to just shoot the messenger. A similar conflict arose within feminism during the second wave when black women complained that the movement was being run by rich, out-of-touch white ladies. These black women wanted to hear sweet fuck all about how oppressive it was for some white bitch to take her husband's last name. And remarkably, feminism survived despite this implicit racism. Yet whether or not it would survive a tacit admission to implicit sexism is a bit of a head-scratcher. Right now, a feminist might say that 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted in their lifetime and that we live in a rape culture. Even if you accept this statistic, a far larger proportion of American men have been victims of genital mutilation. Feminists complain that rape victims are not taken seriously despite rape shield laws and the abusive treatment of due process perpetrated by the #MeToo Salem bitch trials. Meanwhile, intactivists are openly mocked and derided. A person who is guilty of raping a woman is at least pressured to deny it by society that seeks to lynch them, whereas doctors who professionally rape babies with knives are free to advertise their services. The Canadian Don't Be That Guy campaign slanders all men as potential rapists, saying men must be taught not to rape. When a man invents color-changing nail polish in a clever, thoughtful attempt to solve a problem that he only believes is significant because of feminist propaganda in the first place, he is smeared as being part of the problem for putting too much responsibility on women. A man is expected to risk his own safety to intervene, yet a woman cannot be expected to take any precaution to avoid that danger herself. Meanwhile, infant males are raped with knives with their parents' consent. Imagine for a moment if every case of date rape or regret rape or UVA's Jackie totally being real required that girl's parents' consent to her being raped. Now you fucking tell me where the real rape culture is. People who say that MRAs are often too radical or have become a mirror to feminists have no fucking idea what they're talking about. The men's movement has achieved nothing, and hysteric Mad Max rapescapes of oppression that feminists want everybody to believe they're living in is not even half as savage as the reality that men are accustomed to and endure without complaint. So this Sunday, when I'm protesting the most common, horrific, and easily preventable form of sexual violence in America, I will have one question for the people of the women's movement. What issue are you focusing on that matters more than this? If feminists had one good answer to that question, they could destroy the men's movement overnight. I maintain that they lack the intellect, the integrity, and the basic human empathy necessary to do so. And absolutely nothing in the entire history of the women's movement stands to contradict me. Thank you so much for listening. My channel is Spacepan. It's a very small, humble channel, which means every single like and every single comment matters, and I basically live here, so I am more than happy to discuss these topics with anyone who's interested or to clarify anything that I might have said that's confusing here. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks again, and thanks to Prince for giving me this platform here. You guys have a great day. Thanks.